Well, this is the reason why I think it's really important to take a big step back and say, what kind of family do you want? And this is why I always love having that conversation early before we disagree on all kinds of, other issues about whether or not it makes sense for the government to get involved and subsidize daycare and subsidize, education and try to put its weight behind getting more women in the boardroom and all these conversations. I think we have to take this enormous step back and say, well, what kind of family do you want? If you're going to create the kind of family that's going to maximize a woman's ability to work outside the home, and that's I think the assumption that we're starting with, then of course you do need all of these, all of these things to prop up a system like that. If the assumption is no, I want the kind of family where both the mother and father primarily see themselves as building a household, and even when the father goes to work, he's not doing it to build an identity. He's doing it in order to build a household with his wife, and so she's at home and doing the primary task that he's primarily attempting to fund and wants to participate in as well as much as possible. If you're building that kind of a family, then of course one of the problems is that you don't want the government to be super involved, taking away responsibilities. You don't want the government taxing these families. One of the things that's really interesting is that they're constantly referring to economic problems that make it difficult for families to actually do the kinds of things in the home that Michael was referring to. And at the same time, they were constantly advocating for more government programs that would provide more for the family. And you have to understand that these two ideas are linked. That if you have more government programs, then you're going to have to tax the family more and more. And so that's going to make it more and more difficult. You're really just transferring the money from the family to the government in order to get the money back to the family in a much less efficient way, because the government's going to take enormous amounts of that money. You're going to get pennies on the dollar back to the family. And then when you get it, it's like, yeah, of course, now we have an economic problem. And I think this is like a cycle that we're in right now where the government essentially creates a problem that they could only solve through more taxes and bigger government. And so you're in this constant cycle. And there these women are just falling into it and advocating for it as a means as just an act of kindness. Like we just need to grow the government more and more and more. We take more and more and more away from the family in order to have more and more for the family. It's like these two concepts are in contradiction with each other. You have to decide which direction you want to go. And the problem is this is sort of a collective decision. This is a political decision at this point. I wish that it weren't political. Like if the government just stayed out of it and didn't try to engineer any kind of particular family entitlements, then what would happen is that every family would get to decide what kind of family they want to create. And if they want to create the kind of family that where they keep their money and invest it in their home and try to live off of one income and be frugal and have the mother stay in the home and educate the children, then you're gonna have the ability to do that. You're not gonna have somebody interfering continuously with that by offering services and forcing you to pay for services you're never going to use. But unfortunately, we've made this other decision collectively. Like we will take that money from you, whether you use the services or not. We will drain the money out of your family. We will create a culture around you where the government is responsible for the aging parents. The government is responsible for the young children. The government is responsible for educating everybody. The government's responsible for making sure that if there's any kinds of issues or any kinds of problems that we're going to step in, and you want to encroach more and more and more and more into that space so that even things like maternity leave are paid for by the government, so that if you decide that creates a culture where women go back to work, right? It doesn't create an 18-year situation where women are at home. It creates a situation where it's like, what's your problem? You can take your 6 months off. The government's going to ensure that you get that money. And then when you get back to work, like everybody should, then your 6-month-old can go into daycare. And then we start the cycle back over again. So this is a loop that's essentially being advocated for. And there's so many connected and basically philosophical, theological, and political assumptions that are baked into all of these conversations that I think aren't being teased out properly in the conversation.